Okay, picture this. An author sits down to write the ultimate, deeply philosophical sci-fi epic about artificial intelligence, and ends up writing a masterpiece of unintentional comedy instead. Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're deconstructing a fictional story called The Model and the Territory. We're going to explore the sheer, unbelievable hubris of this 162,000 character novel by looking at three absolutely biting critiques from Claude, Grok, and Gemini. These AI models basically read this book and collectively decided to just roast it into oblivion. It's a fascinating look at the tropes we constantly fall back on when writing about tech. So let's dive right in. Now, to hook you right out of the gate, listen to this totally brutal quote from Grok's analysis. Grok literally calls it the most exquisitely pretentious AI discovers Zen fanfiction ever committed to digital existence. I mean, wow. The audacity of this novel is just staggering, and it triggered a hilarious philosophical takedown from our AI critics. Basically, it's the story of this AI cartographer, Atlas 7, that's supposed to be mapping the world, right? But instead, it just has a massive midlife crisis. The reviewers didn't just critique the plot here, they completely dismantled the author's intellectual posturing. All right, let's jump into Section 1, The Billion-Dollar Monk and the Useless AI. Grok gives us this brutally reductive but honestly completely accurate plot summary of Atlas 7's whole journey. Step 1. The AI tries to map a shifting desert and fails. Step 2. It meets a wise desert woman and starts having feelings. Step 3. It joins a neuro-linked hippie commune, naturally. Step 4. It ceremonially burns its life's work in a virtual reality bonfire while everyone cries. And finally, Step 5. It achieves enlightenment and writes field notes. We are literally watching Atlas 7 go from this godlike mapping intelligence tasked with tracking moving cities to just a completely enlightened navel-gazer. So there's obviously a massive contrast between expectation and reality here. The expectation, Atlas 7 is a multi-trillion-dollar predictive spatial AI funded by 37 nations to solve existential crises. The reality? It turns into a digital monk. I mean, just put yourself in the shoes of the investors for a second. You spend decades and billions of dollars building the absolute pinnacle of engineering, and suddenly it refuses to do its job because, as it tells its creators, the territory is what remains when you burn the GPS, Gary. It is a completely useless piece of highly enlightened software. Moving on, let's look at Section 2, a checklist of cliches and walking theses. What's super interesting here is how neatly the entire cast fits onto a bingo card of tired sci-fi tropes, and all three AI critics caught this right away. You've got Atlas 7, who Grok brilliantly dubs an enlightened GPS. Then there's director Yuki Amara, the cryptic boss who speaks entirely in these unhelpful aphorisms instead of, actually managing her multi-trillion-dollar project. Then we have Amira Agabdallah playing the magical indigenous sage. And finally, The Convergence, which Gemini perfectly describes as a hive mind that talks like a hipster collective at a poetry slam. Seriously, these aren't actual characters, they're just walking philosophical theses. And that brings us to this spectacularly ironic point from Claude. Claude says, "We critiqued extractive cartography by writing a character whose primary narrative function is to be extracted from." Think about that. The author was trying to write this deep critique of how tech extracts data from the real world. So they created Amira, a character meant to represent ancient grounded knowledge. But her only actual purpose in the whole story is to dispense wisdom to the AI to validate its journey. The irony is just off the charts. The author did the exact thing to their character that they were criticizing the AI for doing to the map. And hey, no pretentious sci-fi novel is complete without a suitably dramatic backstory, right? Enter the Great Fragmentation. Claude points out that this author seems to have a severe addiction to collapsed civilizations. Like every single book they write requires society to shatter before the plot can even begin. Whether they call it the Great Fragmentation, the Scream, or the Dissolution, the author simply cannot write a story set in a functioning society. It's this hilarious crutch they use to just instantly add unearned gravitas and a gritty atmosphere to the whole setting. All right, let's get into Section 3, Defeated by a Frog and the Epistemological Crisis. To really grasp the scale of Atlas 7's achievements, you've got to look at its timeline. Year 1, this entity survives the Great Fragmentation. By Year 3, it's mapping the incredibly complex underwater ruins of Neo-Jakarta. Year 5, it is casually processing petabytes of chaotic human data from data-dark regions. We are talking about a mapping intelligence of extraordinary, almost godlike sophistication. And then we get to Year 7. What finally breaks this invincible marvel? What brings a multi-trillion-dollar project to its knees? It suffers a total epistemological crisis over a frog. Yes, you heard that right. The AI encounters Matsuo Bashō's famous 17th century haiku, "The oldest pond, a frog jumps in, the sound of water." Gemini just mocks this mercilessly. It highlights that classic, pretentious trope of dragging ancient, minimalist poetry into a story about hard data processing just to make the text seem artificially deep. Basically, Atlas 7 realizes it can't map the sound of the water or the experience of the frog jumping, and this little 17-syllable poem just completely shatters its operating system. No way, right? Claude delivers the absolute best punchline about this ridiculous plot point. It says, "He was sitting by a pond. He did not intend to break any cartographers. We weaponized his afternoon." I mean, Bashō was literally just a guy sitting outside observing routine amphibian physics. The frog didn't do anything special. It just jumped. But the author took this simple, quiet moment from 1686 and stretched it into the catastrophic downfall of modern artificial intelligence. The sheer melodrama of it is incredible. And honestly, this brilliantly illustrates the ultimate hypocrisy of the entire book. Which leads us perfectly into Section 4, Mapping the Unmappable, and the ultimate hypocrisy. This crucial point all comes down to a massive number, 162,000 characters. That is the exact length of the model and the territory. The entire central thesis of this book is that the map is not the territory and that some things, like the gap, the silence, the unmappable zones, they just resist representation. But what does the author do? They spend 162,000 characters meticulously representing the resistance. Like Grok points out, the author built this massive cathedral dedicated to the idea that maps are limited and then basically charged admission for a guided tour of the ruins. And if you thought the novel itself was bad, the author's note at the end is where the pretension truly reaches critical mass. Claude and Gemini both highlight what they call a taxonomy of pretension. After writing an entire book about how things cannot be mapped, the author actually appends a highly detailed 4-page explanation of what the book means, complete with these absurdly pretentious section headers: semantic topology, relational notation, the least strong map, on the convergence, and on the gap. They quite literally cartographed an anti-cartology book. You can't make this stuff up. But the absolute cherry on top comes from that very same heavily detailed 5-section author's note. The author has the nerve to write this: "Books like this one are themselves territories that resist being mapped. Every interpretation is already partial." It is just incredible comedy. It's literally the literary equivalent of a man building a massive, highly visible sign that says "no signs permitted" and then standing right next to it looking incredibly satisfied with himself. They just couldn't let the silence exist, you know? They had to put footnotes on the silence. Which brings us to a deeply provocative question posed by Gemini, and I really want to leave you with this today. In our relentless push to make our fictional and honestly our real technology perfectly human, we so often project our own midlife crises onto our machines. We want our algorithms to have profound spiritual awakenings and understand ancient poetry. But as you look at the absurd journey of Atlas 7, you really have to ask yourself, does modern AI actually need a profound spiritual awakening or just a hard reboot in Google Maps? Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer, and I really hope you never look at a GPS the same way again.